I'm a police officer based in Oregon. My partner and I were called to a private residence following a disturbance complaint from a neighbor. Having broken into the property, we found several handwritten pages on a coffee table and a digital camera on the floor. I have to share what was written on those pages despite the professional repercussions I could face. To protect those involved, names have been changed. Everything else is transcribed as written.
To those who know me and those who don't, my name is David Thane. I'm writing this should something render me unable to tell of my experience. Whether you believe me or not is out of my control, but it's important you know. This camera gives or takes time from its living subjects. To elaborate, when a living thing is photographed, the camera can either increase the age of that thing or decrease it. It's completely random. For example, it could age something by 20 years or de-age it by 3 days. It also might not have any effect at all. It can't be chosen or manipulated. I've experimented more than I can count. I acquired this camera in 2005 at an unusual auction in Seattle. My good friend Jeff owned an antique store outside of Eugene, Oregon. He heard about the auction through fellow antique enthusiasts and invited me along for the ride. Upon entering the building through a door located down a dark alleyway, we were searched by security guards with WWE physiques. I asked Jeff if that was normal, to which he replied not exactly. We soon realized that it wasn't just any auction. The items were previously owned by serial killers, cult leaders, and witches, to name a few, at least according to the stories told by the auctioneer. Jeff and I looked at each other with raised eyebrows on more than one occasion. There was a large screen behind the stage that displayed the items close up. Though a lot of them were old or rustic, there were modern items too, such as an iPod and a Furby. Then the camera came out. It was just a generic silver digital camera with a zoom and image screen on the back, the kind that cost around $300 back then. Not a lot is known about this item, said the auctioneer.
It was in the possession of an unidentified elderly woman who was admitted to St. Luke's Boise Medical Center. She was said to have been rambling nonsensically about the camera before death. There are no identifying features. Therefore, it can't be traced. It doesn't appear to have any means to charge. However, it seems to have a continuous source of power.
I had been wanting to get a digital camera myself. That being said, so far, the items had been selling in the thousands, which was way above my budget.
We'll start the bid at $50.
A few seconds went by in total silence. I quickly scanned the room, and no one seemed to be interested in the camera. I slowly raised my paddle, feeling a bit silly as I'd never attended an auction before. Before I knew it, the hammer came down and I was the owner of that camera.
You do realize that you've just spent $50 on useless junk,
said Jeff as he drove us back to Oregon. How so?
It has no ports. How are you going to transfer the photos to your laptop?
That was something I hadn't considered. For $50, I can live with that. I was surprised to find some photos still in the camera memory. There was one of a smiling woman who looked around late 20s. She had a nose ring, and her hair was dyed red. The next photo was of a young girl with light hair, no more than 8. She was visibly upset, tears streaming down her face. It was weird to see. I skipped to the next photo. It was an older woman around 60 or so with long gray hair. Her expression was one of shock.
Let's christen that thing,
said Jeff, making me jump. I switched the camera to action mode and held it at arm's length, leaning over to Jeff. Okay, don't take your eyes off the road for too long. Say useless junk. Useless junk, we both yelled, and I snapped the picture. After a couple of hours, we stopped at a service station for some food. Before we went in, I took a photo of some pigeons that were pecking around a tree at the entrance. We ate at Burger King before Jeff excused himself for the bathroom. I said I'd meet him outside, being a smoker at the time.
That's disgusting,
said a woman, waving a hand in front of her face as she walked past me. I thought she was talking about my cigarette, until I noticed the bad smell too. There were dead pigeons around the tree in various states of decay. I put out the cigarette and took out my camera. There were 7 pigeons that were very much alive in the last photo. Now, there were at least 3 pigeon carcasses swarming with flies.
David, look at my fucking hair, yelled Jeff as he came outside. He sounded concerned.
What's wrong with it? I asked. He pointed to the hair above his ears.
The gray. When did I start going gray?
There were flecks of gray that I couldn't say I noticed before, but as I looked more closely, I could see slight differences in his features too. The lines around his eyes were more pronounced. I looked at the picture I took of us in the car, both with wide grins. Zooming in on Jeff, his hair was very dark, no sign of gray. I showed him.
What the hell?
He said. The pigeons are dead. My stomach dropped. You don't think?
I think we need to leave and not speak of this again.
When I got home, I looked through the photos again. Something I hadn't noticed was the women in the original images were all wearing the same top. You could see that it was too big on the young girl. There were also facial similarities that suggested it was the same person, though the images looked like they were snapped consecutively over a few minutes. Another thing I noticed was a series of small numbers displayed under the women. Under the smiling 20-something, it read 9,465,694. Under the crying young girl, it read 28,400,554. And under the shocked older woman, it read 18,409,339. The next image was of Jeff and I. Under Jeff was 2,629,000, and under me was 3,602. It was the same with the pigeons. There were numbers under all of them, although some displayed 0. I also noticed a 0 under the tree. Using a calculator, I worked out that the numbers most likely reflected minutes, and the or reflected whether they were added or subtracted to from the subject. The woman had aged many years. I would bet everything that the rambling elderly woman in the hospital was that woman in the photos. Jeff had aged around 5 years, enough to notice the differences. I had apparently de-aged an insignificant amount of days. The unlucky pigeons had gone past their expiration dates. That weird auction had been the real deal. There was enough evidence to not mess with the camera again. I couldn't help myself though, so I began experimenting with it. I bought a pack of 6 red delicious apples and lined them up on my kitchen counter. I snapped a picture of them. Within seconds, changes were made. 3 stayed as they were, but 2 disappeared completely, and 1 was a pile of mush. I took a trip to a local woodland area, and making sure no one else was around, took a photo of some trees and foliage. With each picture I took, the scene changed dramatically. It was fascinating. Jeff came over for some beers one evening shortly after our Seattle trip.
Carla is freaking out. To be honest, I'm freaking out too.
He said, referring to his wife.
I mean about the...
I pointed to my hair.
I was hoping she wouldn't notice, which was foolish. It was the first thing she mentioned when I got home.
I explained what I'd discovered about the camera, showing him the various pictures. He didn't want to believe it, so I demonstrated by taking a picture of a potted cactus. Within seconds, it had visibly expanded. Jeff gasped. I showed him the image, with the number 3457 displayed underneath.
It increased by almost 8 months, I said, using my calculator. If my theory of minutes is correct, that is. Do you think there's a way to put me back to how I was?
He asked. I shook my head. I don't think so, man. Not that I can tell. There aren't any functions, so to speak, on the camera itself. It's very basic. Just a zoom, snap, and cycling through the memory.
Maybe we can try.
He said, biting his thumbnail. That's insane, I said. You were lucky you only got 5 years.
Easy for you to say. You only got a few days, minus I hasten to add.
He said. It's not a competition, I said. We were both lucky. That woman aged by around 70 years.
I feel strange, David.
He said.
Knowing 5 years have gone like that is making me crazy.
I get it, I said. But it's too risky. After a while, Jeff broke the silence.
You're right, I'm being stupid.
I went to the kitchen to grab more beers. When I came back, he was holding the camera out with the lens facing him. Jeff, I yelled, followed by the sound of the snap. I froze on the spot as I waited for the inevitable change. I could see his hands shaking.
Well,
he said. I put the beers down and took the camera from him, then had a closer look. The gray in his hair had gone. I looked at the image, Jeff looking like a deer in the headlights. The numbers read 3,155,001.
Well,
He repeated. -6 years, I said, my heart beating out of my chest.
you fucking idiot.
He burst out laughing.
Just when I think my gambling days are over, I get another whole year back.
Some years passed and I had put the camera in a safe place. It didn't stop me thinking about it though. One day I happened to notice an ad for a camera specialist in Eugene. It prompted me to take it out of storage. The last image of Jeff greeted me as I switched it on. I couldn't believe it still had power. I took a drive into the city.
What can I do for you?
Asked the woman in the store. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about this camera, I said, handing it to her. I acquired it a few years ago. It's kind of unusual,
I'll say.
she said.
On the surface, it looks like a Nikon Coolpix or a Sony DSC. What brand is it?
I was hoping you could tell me,
Interesting. There
she said, genuinely intrigued.
are no ports for external connection. No apparent battery slots. No seams or screws. What's the power source?
I let out a laugh. Again, I was hoping you could tell me. I know very little. Very little came a screech to my right. Jesus Christ, I yelled. There was a blue and yellow macaw perched on the end of the counter. I hadn't even noticed it,
That's Percy.
she said. She powered on the camera and the internal mechanism whirred as the lens extended slightly.
I'm speechless.
It was worth a shot, I said, reaching out.
Wait a sec.
She said.
Would you be open to me investigating further?
How so? What?
Well, with the right tools, I could take a look inside it.
I don't know, I said. I wouldn't want it getting damaged. She glared at me.
Honey, I'm an expert. I don't damage shit.
I held up my hands. Sorry. How much would that cost?
No charge.
She said.
We'll call it professional curiosity.
I held out my hand. Deal.
Steal.
Screeched Percy. She shook my hand.
I'm Marlene, by the way.
David. Oh, one thing, Marlene, I don't recommend taking any pictures with IT. She looked confused.
That's pretty fundamental, David.
I know. But like I said, it's unusual. I'd prefer you didn't. She shrugged.
Whatever you say. Come back around noon tomorrow. Should be plenty of time.
When I arrived back at the store the next day, I was surprised to find it closed. Marlene, I called, knocking on the door. I headed down the alleyway to the side of the building and found a back door. I knocked a few times before trying it. The door pushed open. Marlene, it's David. Are you here? I could hear a sound like quiet sobbing and a high-pitched squawk. I followed the sounds, calling out as I walked down the corridor. I found a dimly lit room. It was a workshop with a bench and various tools. There were different kinds of cameras laying around. Some with parts missing. Marlene, I called out quietly.
What? What is this thing?
I heard from a corner. Her voice sounded delicate, croaky. It was followed by that little squawk. I could see her sitting on the floor with her legs stretched out. Her hair was white and wiry. She had looked around 40-ish when I'd seen her the day before. Now she was at least 90. The deep wrinkles on her face suggested she had lived a long, hard life. She held the camera in one hand and in the other was a featherless baby bird. Percy. Oh, Marlene, I told you not to use it.
You could have been more specific.
She said weakly. I'm sorry, I said, stepping closer.
Stay back.
She said, holding out the camera. I raised my hands, which began to tremble. Please, be reasonable. She tried to laugh, which became a cough.
Look at me, David. I'm a relic. And look at Percy.
Sometimes it works in your favor. It happened to my friend. It reversed the aging. He's back to the way he was.
You think I didn't already try that?
She said. Let me try, I said, holding out a hand. Give me the camera, Marlene. What have you got to lose? You look.
Dead.
She said.
I can feel it. I'm dying.
So let me help, I said, stepping closer.
No.
she yelled, and a bright light filled the room as she snapped a photo. My heart jolted as I felt a sudden change in my body. She looked momentarily stunned, giving me a chance to grab the camera. I took several steps back before my legs gave way, the adrenaline getting the better of me. I leaned against the wall on the opposite side of the room, bringing up the last image. My eyes were wide, mouth wide open, arm outstretched. Underneath was the number 6,332,558. I sighed with relief.
Do it.
Said Marlene.
Take the damn picture.
She held Percy to her chest. I stood up. Are you sure? He closed her eyes and nodded. I obliged. In a flash, there was a skeleton propped against the wall, making me gasp. Its arms fell to the side, bones rattling noisily on the floor as little Percy squawked. I crawled over and picked him up, holding him against my thumping heart. Later that day when I was home, I looked at the images and did the calculations. I was around 19 years old, give or take. It had added over 20 years to Marlene, putting her at around 112. Percy remained the same, displaying 0. But before I left, I tried another experiment. I took a picture of Marlene's bones, hoping that it could be reversed. The image displayed no numbers at all. Over the years leading up to now, I've taken risks and snapped pictures of myself. I didn't have much choice, as explaining how I was a teenager again wasn't really an option. I got somewhat lucky and calculated that at one point, I was no more than 2 years older than I should have been, which I was happy to stick with. I contemplated discarding the camera, smashing it, burning it, burying it. But something stopped me from doing so. Instead, I put it in a safe place. For a while, I even forgot it existed. I shared my home with Percy, raising him from a chick with the help of specialist books. He became a beautiful blue and yellow macaw once again. I wondered if he retained the memories of Marlene. That leads me up to now. What spurred me to write this? I went to the cupboard, the one where I kept the camera tucked away in a box. As soon as I opened the doors, I heard the whirring of the internal mechanism. It was too late. Before I could close the doors, a flash temporarily blinded me as I stumbled back. There was an instant pain in my head, and my joints felt like I'd run a marathon. The skin on my hands was thin and blotchy. I picked up the camera, sitting on top of the box. It felt twice as heavy as it usually did. The last image of me, desperately trying to evade capture, displayed the number 34,287,406. Percy was cautious of me when I shuffled into the living room, until he realized it was me. I'm now in that situation where I have nothing to lose. I can feel death is almost here. I think Percy knows it too, as he won't leave my side. So before I willingly take this picture, should the worst happen, here is my written experience. My hands aren't what they used to be, so I hope this is legible. Please share it. This camera is a wonderful thing in a lot of ways. It makes me wonder what else exists in the world. But should you find it, don't be tempted like I was. I wouldn't want this to be your story too. I don't want Percy in the photo, but he refuses to leave me, so I guess we will face this together. Best regards, David Thane.
I'm sharing this as requested. Although I don't want to believe it's true, I can't dispute the evidence. The neighbor who called had complained about a constant cry for help, as well as a high-pitched screaming. We learned it was a parrot crying for help. The screaming came from a baby boy, laying amongst a pile of adult men's clothing. The last image on the camera depicted the parrot with the number 10,080 displayed beneath, and a sickly-looking old man wearing those very clothes, along with the number 51,018,332.
Hello everyone. Thank you for listening to Chilling Sleep. I hope I'll see you again soon.